making sure that you're getting value out of your Scrum. We have a bunch of topics to talk about. Or if you're like, I don't know, maybe you're feeling like you have Scrum, but it's not really working for you, your organization or whatever. Or maybe you, because of the way your organization is built, you can only influence so much at one time, right? Maybe you're not doing really effective Scrum because of the way your organization is built. If I were to pick one of these topics to start with and then try to lead from this to everything else, it would be constantly learning and evolving. If you can start with that, maybe you can have influence to these other things. Because I think of a team, oh, we're going on our retro, and our retro is 30 minutes, and we're going to open up a doc and write like, oh, we agreed to do this, we agreed to do this, or whatever, and then nobody looks at the doc after. If you're using Scrum and you're not taking the time at the end of the cycle to try to change something and improve for the next iteration, think about it for the team or for the product, right? You're not agreeing to commit to improve anything. Like, why?
That just means that you think there's nothing to improve and you've reached that nirvana state, right? Which most teams never actually get to. So yeah, there's definitely a need to improve and look back and say, not necessarily even look at that and say what went wrong or anything like that. It's just, what can we be doing better going forward? How can we improve incrementally, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely agree with that topic. Constantly learning and evolving your practice, your craft.
Yeah. I don't know. Where would I even start? Let's pretend I was like a manager in the organization. Oh, let's pretend that I'm like, I don't want to be the development manager, but I mean, somebody has to be, but right. I don't want to be the guy. Let's pretend that I'm a manager in the organization, like a people manager. So I have some resources on a bunch of different teams. Is there things that I could be asking of the teams to be sure that they're improving? Or what would alert me that teams are kind of doing this like zombie Scrum where they're not, you know what I mean? They're never really improving. They're just kind of punching the boxes.
There's a lot of things that you can look at and say, are they repeating the same things over and over and over again, right? And here, I don't mean the good practice, obviously the bad practices. And they're not making a difference, not moving the needle whatsoever. Then definitely they're just ticking the boxes.
Yeah.
To your earlier example of doing a retro, get together at the end of a sprint when people are tired, they don't want to be there, and it's like, what went well? I'm not going to be bothered to think about it.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. So I think if you're quote unquote resource manager in that example, you can be looking at how the team is delivering and say, well, they're making the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah.
Can they be improving? And that can be an ask of the team, not necessarily an individual, but how can you collectively, team, right? How can you be getting better?
We talked about the team holding itself accountable. Like this kind of goes in line with that. Like if the team is making the same mistakes, the team should be the first person to say, wait a minute, we're making the same mistake that we made, whatever, a couple sprints ago, or we're still having the same problem. For example, we're dragging 3/4 of our stories from the previous sprint to the next sprint again and again and again, and we can't break out of this cycle. Like, how many sprints are you going to keep doing that before somebody is like, let's try something? Doesn't matter how bad the idea is, but let's try something to stop doing this, to get to the root of it. Like, if the team just constantly keeps doing that, they're obviously not improving. The reason I bring that up is because not really to ask for how to resolve that situation, but if the team is not taking ownership of that failure, I'll call it a failure. I'll be the first guy. Who's gonna do it? I mean,
yeah, it's the ostrich mentality, right? So we're let's just take that as an example.
Yeah,
they're rolling work from one sprint to the next, and they do it one time, and you know it's been done. Everybody's aware of it. Then you do it again. At that point, questions have to be asked. It's like, why are we doing this again and again, right? And if we're changing nothing, guess what's going to happen this current sprint? Same thing. So that's the ostrich mentality. Is if we do nothing, maybe it'll just get better. It's the hope and pray. It's the hope and pray, right? And that never works. So here I would rely on the coach of this organization, which is typically a Scrum Master to begin with, to say, process-wise, what are we doing? Are our stories too big, for instance?
Yeah.
Right? Are we back-ending the testers towards the end of the sprint? There are things you can do about those things, but if you choose to ignore it, it will come back and haunt you over and over again.
Yeah. This is interesting because constantly learning could also be asking for help when you know that the team doesn't have the right skill. Well, you just bring up, if the stories are too big, and the product person obviously is not, maybe the product person is like, I'm too busy, or maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a legitimate reason. I kind of hear that as like that turns into an excuse in my head. So that's not
Yeah.
great. But usually it'll be the team confronting the product person to be like, you need to learn how to write better stories. I kind of like, that's not a great reason for me, because I kind of think that I told my latest team this. I was like, in the future evolution of this team, should they stay together for a long time, y'all will be writing the stories, and I'll just be bringing the what I want to you. Because they were talking about, I remember we got into a conversation about pointing, estimation, and what the future looks like. I was like, well, in the future, I hope that we get to a point where all the stories basically are about the same size, and then we don't need to spend any time on pointing. They'll just be a story, and you'll take in X number of stories, and we'll know that the team generally deals with X number of stories. I was like, but in order to do that, the team has to take total ownership of writing the stories, because when the team owns the stories, the team can control's not a great word, but control the size of each story.
Yeah.
Ensure the size of each story.
Yeah. Ensure influence.
Standardize the size of it. I don't know the proper word that I'm trying to figure out, but I'm saying the point of me saying is the team will understand the proper size to break each story down, and they'll be able to do it. And I'll just
they stay together long enough, they're going to intuitively get to that point and not even worry about story points, right? So the person that actually came up with this whole concept, which seemed like a good idea at the time, probably was Ron Jeffries. Mm-hmm. He's now saying that it's possibly the worst thing he invented. These are his words, not mine. And that's because people weaponize these things.
Right.
And we've talked about that in different podcasts as well. So the key to all of this is two things, right? Coming back to our point here, constantly learning and adjusting. That's obviously the crux of it.
Yeah.
But the other is the longevity of the team, because when you're changing team members, that kind of goes against this, right? So if the team is staying together long enough, they will work together with the POs and everybody else and go, hey, it just feels too big.
Right.
You know, we tried it before, it didn't work, so maybe we can try it as an experiment to break it down into 2 or 3 and see how it goes.
Yeah.
So it'll shake itself out in the process as long as they're aware that they have to change something.
Yeah. I wonder, like, if you had a retro and the team was like, well, we're just not good at writing stories. We need someone to come in and kind of help us write the stories. And that, I don't know, you hire a consultant or get somebody from another team or borrow somebody from another team or shared services or whatever. I don't know what you would put that time on. If you had to hire somebody from outside, like a consulting business analyst or something like that, help you write stories, help you interview users, help you guys get that skill if you've never had it before. I guess a certain percentage of that person's time could be booked off of wherever budget training comes from, whatever pool of money, assuming you do any training.
That's a segue into a different topic, which we'll get to shortly.
But I mean, it's all about like it's all about asking what the team needs for. It's like the team is the number one people that should be recognizing, hey, we have deficiencies in whatever area. We need help with it, and then asking for it rather than trying to hide that stuff.
Man. Dude, the teams, in my experience, are notoriously bad at that because they look at that as an inwardly personal sort of challenge. Like when we ask for help, it shows that we're vulnerable and we're no good, right?
Admitting failure or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. And maybe it's a display of weakness or whatever it is that they feel. I tend to look at this the opposite way. It's like the earlier you ask for help, the sooner we can remedy the issue, right? Yeah. So that's something. I think that's something that a Scrum Master or whoever, Agile coach, they need to encourage that and say, ask for help, please.
Yeah, that should be, as a leader in the organization, otherwise known as managers, but as a leader in the organization, that should be a gift to you because your people are going out of their way to tell you where you should focus your effort to make them more productive or to help them out. Whereas normally you have to kind of suss that out and discover it and uncover it and go through couch cushions.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, I agree. But unfortunately, what I found in real life is people tend not to speak up, and they see this as a vulnerability. But here's the other thing. You bring in a consultant, let's say, in that example you used, right? So you learn to write better stories and stuff like that. Those skills have to be then embedded in the team.
Sure.
So when the consultant leaves after a short period of time, you don't want the team to gravitate back to what they were doing, right? So that becomes one of the commitments that the team makes. So there's 2 parts to this commitment. One is on the leadership side. So we're going to spend money. We're going to bring in consultants to help you get better. Yeah. The team then commits to learn from that and embody those learnings so that the money hasn't been wasted on this stuff. It's not like one and done type of thing, right? So as leadership, you need to look at that and say, how effective has that been? So that's like ground zero. Then you get ahead of that and go, do you need this? Do you need help on CI/CD automation or DevOps or anything like that? Just get ahead of that. They don't have to understand the technology. They just have to understand what the ask is.
I mean, I kind of think of Agile coaching in the same vein as the BA kind of deal. It probably benefits you as a business to have these people who came in and trained your team, because then you can reach out to them in the future and be like, hey, can you come back in and do a refresher? Or maybe X percentage of the team members change, come back in and do a much smaller subset of hours, because the majority of people just need to kind of be refreshed or kind of mentored or whatever. And then you have a business relationship, just like a vendor. You know what I mean? Just like a vendor you're buying parts from or buying software from. You have the person responsible for training and occasionally come back in and kind of help you stay on track.
Yeah, absolutely. And that works really well if you have that expertise in-house, whether it's another team or not.
I was going to say this, I'm kind of looking at it from a small company perspective. If you're a much larger organization, then you probably have people in your program or people in some kind of shared services role or people around the organization that can just kind of pop over and help you or whatever. And then you just move some money around on whatever budgets that you have to pay for the help. But yeah, this is a concern with me because a lot of teams out there, number one, they don't use all the time. And number two, I know they, like the Scrum guide now, just generally throws out numbers, and they got rid of the whole, if you this many hours for this many, whatever, 0.75 hours per week or whatever. They got rid of that. I don't know if that was a good, like, I personally don't feel like that was a good thing of like completely scrapping the guidelines, but I understand why they did it. But
yeah, I think it's one of the other things you could look at it in any team is, look, you always have the evidence of what they've been doing when it comes to constantly evolving and learning in terms of like retrospectives. What are their findings and what have they done with those? To your point, do they go through the retro at the mechanistic kind of thing, right? And then they just document it and nobody looks at it again. Or do they actively come back to it frequently during the sprint? I know some teams will create work items, right? And they'll assign them to people. And if I were a developer on a team and you're assigning me a work item like that, that's not a core development item, I'm going to say, well, I don't know how many hours that's going to take me to improve the process. I'm not an expert at that. I'm an expert at coding. Let me code. So that's an issue. The other thing that happens is it pollutes your statistics, right? So now you've got 2, maybe 3 stories, PBIs or whatever, that presumably have to be sized in some way or not. If you don't size them, then you can't complain that nobody actually worked on them. There's all these complications. So I just like, now I've got to the point where I don't bother with any of that, right? And that's because what happened in my experience, at least, and maybe everybody else is different here, they'll put them on the backlog for the next sprint, and then they get pushed to the bottom because everybody's focused on the work at hand. And then at the end of the sprint, they go, yeah, we didn't really get to that. We'll get to it next sprint. But then you have another retro and you have 2 or 3 more things. Right? So what I do now instead is forget about creating PBIs. Whatever board you use where people vote on the top 2 or 3 items, I just take a screenshot of that. And I post it on the dashboard. The reason I do that is then I ask Scrum Master every other day in the sprint, right, in the 16th minute, to say, just show that. And say, we agreed to do this. Are we doing that? That's it. Just do that. Because it's in front of people, right? And see who talks about it. Somebody will say, no, we haven't done that in a while. Okay, well, can we start to? Right?
I'm going to write this down because we should do a podcast about a better daily Scrum. Let's take these 15 minutes and let's talk about what can you do to be more effective in these 15 minutes. What you're just talking about is let's review, like I already think of like the sprint goal. Like let's start with a sprint goal. Boom, here's a sprint goal. Now let's walk the board. I mean the process. Walk the board.
Oh yeah. There's quite a bit there. We could probably even do an hour.
Now let's hit retro items, and then of course blockers / other activities. They're in here too. We did a podcast about the daily Scrum and something else where we were talking about like unconventional.
Oh yeah.
It was an early. It's actually one of our most downloaded episodes. That is actually one of our most downloaded episodes because I was just looking on metrics today. But a better daily Scrum, it would be a good topic for an episode, specifically talking about an agenda that covers everything, or at least the most things that you want to cover.
Sure, absolutely.
Anyway, I can't remember what we were talking about. I kind of want to pivot to, because we're already talking about time,
right,
and making sure you have enough time. I kind of want to pivot to sprint Scrum event times, because we already kind of dipped into this one. Plus, I think this one's a faster topic than anything else. Sure. I want to get to team building, because I feel like if I'm going to jump to any of these, I want to jump to team building and then to goals. In that conversation, I kind of dipped into using the time allotted, and like I said, like the Scrum guide kind of they give you the wide range of times or whatever, but like the Scrum guide used to say 0.75 hours per week of the sprint, so basically your retro time would be an hour and a half. For the sprint planning, it used to be 2 hours per week of sprint. So your 2-week sprint would be a half a day, basically 4 hours worth of planning. And they got rid of that, and they just gave you a broad window between 1 week and a month. They just gave you whatever that takes, between 2 hours and 8 hours or whatever. And I'm like, well, 2 hours to 8 hours, like that's quite a broad window. Uh-huh. But I think every team I've ever dealt with, I'm constantly, whether I'm the Scrum Master or the product person, constantly elbowing to get more room to say, like, we're not spending enough time planning, because much like the retro, like if you're not spending enough time, the retro is the number one where I see it, because people think they can get done with a retro in 30 minutes. Right. I'm like, you're out of your mind. I can barely even get people to put topics on a board and then sort them, group them. That's
they're just checking a box when they say that.
In 30 minutes.
Honestly.
It's like I can get ideas down and group them. And that pretty much takes 30 minutes. And then we want to have an in-depth discussion. Right. I'm talking, it'd be better to take the whole team to lunch or cater lunch and have everyone eat and then talk about the whole thing over an entire lunch.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But that's after you've got your topics on the board.
Right. Right. So to that end, don't start your topics in the retro, right? Just have a board open at all times during the sprint. That way, because people are tired at the end of a sprint. They can't think of stuff that happened in the first few days of the sprint, let's say. So just have it open and just encourage them. Just say, hey, listen, there's a board over there, right? Just keep putting stuff on there throughout the sprint. So maybe that way, when you start your retro, you could say, well, so far we have these. Let's have a little time box where we can put other things that you might want to talk about, and then get into the in-depth discussions and sorting and all of that good stuff. So that might be something that's useful. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. A lot of teams are just checking a box when they say we can be done in half an hour.
And they can probably get away with that with the retro, but like when it comes to sprint planning, that's very difficult to get away with, because you end up coming out of sprint planning without a plan. And then you constantly have to go back into planning. And every time you pick a work item up, there's a certain amount of uncertainty in what you're going to find and how long it's going to take or whatever. And then now you start overrunning your sprint time box.
Right.
Because you didn't understand the work item when you picked it up, because you didn't spend enough time planning. And we had a podcast a long time ago where we talked about this, and we were like, well, maybe you can, instead of having one long 4-hour go, you can split it up to be like an hour here, hour there, or whatever, hour and a half here, 2 hours here and then 2 hours there, or whatever. Even I will recommend splitting up the what and the how, right, to different sessions. Maybe if those are not immediately back to back, one will be like at the end of the day we'll do the what, and the first thing we walk in the next morning we'll do the how, and it'll be a big developer centric session, deep dive type of session with whatever subject matter experts we need or whatever. But
that's exactly what I was doing when I had an all onshore team.
Yeah.
Now that I have a blend, it's harder to do that because I can't get people at the end of our day in the US. But to your point about breaking up the event into pieces, you could do that. Some teams do what they call pre-refinement, right? And then they'll talk about stuff there, and then they get into planning, and everything that came out of refinement now goes into planning, where they work on the what in the first bit, the POs and everybody else, all the other stakeholders can leave after that, and the team gets down to the how and then break down the work. It doesn't matter how you do it. You cannot shortchange the time it takes. And I'm not suggesting it takes 4 hours. It depends on the team maturity too. But a lot of times when the teams say, well, we understand this, we got this. And then when the sprint starts and they start asking questions around, well, what did you mean by this again? Well, can you explain this again? Those are symptoms that we didn't do a diligent enough job, right, up front. So when you see that, make note and start spending more time, because you'll pay for it many times over. Now you're consuming other people's time too.
Right. I want to ignore the conversation about splitting up the event and all that kind of stuff. I kind of want to put that off to the side for a second, just so we can talk about the purpose of the sprint planning and what happens when you shortchange yourself on the time that you've dedicated. I constantly go back and forth. I told you this before we started, like with one of my teams. The balance that I've found with them is they need to do a bit of solutioning in their head before they can really commit to the concept of sizing something, a complexity. They need to think about what they're going to do a little bit, just a little bit. So what we do is we write out, we're using Jira. It's been a while since I did that. So we have stories, and the stories have subtasks, and we'll write out just the header of the subtask. We'll write out just the title of the subtask. We won't write out details of the subtask. So I'll say, well, hey, I want you guys to build a new API that returns this value, or extend this API and add this value to it, or whatever, or add this to the response to the API, or whatever. And that'll be a story. And the team will say, well, in order to do that, we got to connect to this database, and we got to do whatever. We got to pull it from, or maybe we don't need to connect to it. Maybe we need to find the file or do whatever. Pull a schema in. I don't know, whatever you have to do. They'll talk through how they will do it at a high level. And I'll just, because usually I drive refinements because I'm just much faster. That's the only reason. I would like to get to a point where I don't drive at all, and the team takes complete ownership of that. But if I was a Scrum Master, I certainly would recommend the product person not be driving. I'd be like, you just bring the ideas, and you have all your notes and everything on your screens, and you be fully engaged in the conversation, and I will drive for you. I much prefer that, but whatever, I don't mind. I don't even know why I got on this tangent. To say a high-level solutioning, I'm okay with in a refinement, because again, the refinement is just planning time.
Sure.
I'm starting to vet the idea of, if I'm going to break up my sprint planning and make my refinements like a blend of sprint planning and refinement, because I mean, I'm sure you've been with teams before that in reality their sprint plannings are 50-50 refinement and actual sprint planning. Yeah.
Oh, like, yeah, for sure. I think most of us have. Right?
I'm starting to, like, I'm relaxing on the subject to say, does it really matter if I do a refinement, and my refinement's an hour and a half every week, and then the sprint planning event is actually whatever, 2 hours or whatever, right? So that means I have 5 hours of planning total. That's just 1 hour more than your by the book sprint planning value. So I'm not really impeding very much on Scrum's time, or whatever the time that it recommends. I'm starting to relax my opinion on whether at refinement we only do refinement at high level type of stuff, and whether at sprint planning we only do low level stuff. I'm starting to say, like, does it really matter? It
doesn't. I'm a firm believer in not being dogmatic about it. I think every team's different. Some teams do it one way, some another way, some a blend. So it doesn't matter. I think the thing to look at, though, is retrospectively look at the effectiveness of what you're doing, and then tweak those things, right?
Let me argue about that in the spirit of arguing Agile. Sure. The only thing that might happen is if we plan something out in a refinement, at the first refinement, because remember, we have one refinement and then another refinement and then the sprint planning. So at the first refinement, if we plan something out low level, and then at the sprint planning, something changes in priority, I could be in a position where I've planned something out to a low level, and now we're basically deprioritizing that work.
Sure,
you know?
You could. And that might be because you just came across a dependency, right, that cannot be met in time. But that low-level planning isn't a waste, because you've still got that captured somewhere. You've gone through the exercise. It's just not now. So maybe in a sprint or two's time, when that dependency can be met, but then at that time, surely it's going to save the team some time, because you've already gone through it once. Granted, it's a little stale. Somebody's going to have to remind people, but it's not starting from scratch. Right? So it's not a total waste.
Yeah. The way I'm thinking about this now is, if you're not getting too far ahead of your team's velocity, too many sprints ahead, it's okay to kind of move work around up and down a little bit. As long as you're not, like, what I will do is, if I'm so far ahead, if I'm more than 2-ish sprints ahead velocity-wise from my team, I'll just cancel a refinement. I'll be like, we don't need this extra refinement this week. And that's how I'll keep us from going over. Like, what I'm talking about is, like, I don't want to plan too far ahead and then have to shuffle stuff down, and then we don't work on it for now. We've wasted some time planning. I kind of get around that in just adjusting my just-in-time planning time that I've reserved.
I think that's good, because again, following dogmatic Scrum, you'd go, no, we have to have this, right? We have to have this, and then that sometimes bites you. So I think that's good. Again,
going back to why this thing is on here, shortcutting planning, shortcutting any of the events, cutting that time box prematurely, and not talking about the consequences and facing it as a team. What's a good word? Identifying the shortcoming you're dealing with is because you've taking a shortcut during your planning and cut your time off. Not tracking your problem back to that. When you do 5 whys, you're like, your 5 why doesn't identify, like, not enough time was spent in planning. Usually the thing that will come up in 5 whys is like, the requirements weren't good enough. Or we ran into a thing that we didn't know we had this dependency until we started working on it. Why? Oh, well, we didn't have the dependency, so in the future we just got to not have the dependency. Well, that's not the reason. No. The reason is you didn't spend enough time truly doing a deep dive and analyzing in the time that you had. And the last thing I'll say on this before, I know that I've beaten this dead horse enough, but the last thing I will say on this is fine and good for your normal team. But when you get into a larger organization and you start dealing with capitalization, you'll get into a world of hurting if you're stopping your development work and going back to the planning phase and then starting your development work again. Because now you're messing with the capitalization formula.
Correct.
You can't just say our sprint planning is every Monday between 8 a.m. and noon, and that's a 4-hour block. And that is when we do planning. So that 4-hour block, you can't capitalize.
I absolutely agree. I think generally speaking, to kind of sum it all up, cut down your planning events at your peril.
Yeah.
Basically. Because they will come back to haunt you.
The next thing out of getting more value out of Scrum is when we talked about retrospectives, the thing we kind of skipped over was the team building aspect of retrospectives. You won't get great retrospectives if you're not doing any team building activities. You know what I mean? Team building activities to me are members of the team are having one-on-ones with other members of the team, or the Scrum Masters having one-on-ones, or even the product people, I guess, having one-on-ones. And people are getting to know each other, and people understand how to work with each other. People are swarming. You're doing things where the team members are learning how to collaborate and work together constantly. Some of that comes out in the retrospectives. The teams that I have worked on who have been excellent at collaboration all had been together for a while. So they've had the benefit of doing these team building things over time. So it's not really tied to retrospective, but that's probably the first place that I will see that there's a problem with team building, or that hasn't been, properly done, or not enough time has gone into it.
Yeah, I certainly concur with that. And, I would say this though. So team building is essential.
Yeah.
Right. But it doesn't have to be necessarily tied to retrospectives, because when you start adding activities in your retro time box for team building, now you're shortchanging the actual retro activities as well. Right. The other thing is retros happen at the end of the sprint typically. Yeah. Team building can happen throughout the sprint. There's no time for team building other than now. It's any time in the sprint, you could be doing this stuff. Yeah. When we were in person, it was a lot easier for obvious reasons, right? Water cooler conversations or whatever it is, you're building rapport with your team and trust, and you're promoting that. Yeah. But now it's a little bit harder. It's not impossible. I think we have to go out of our way a little bit more as Scrum Masters or Agile coaches to kind of encourage the team to get to know one another and not hide behind a little box on a, chat somewhere. But there are things you can do. Team building activities. Oftentimes you have to ask for budget for that kind of stuff. Yeah. But there's other things you can do. You don't necessarily have to spend money all the time. It does help to have a little. But there's fun activities you can build in. So things like icebreakers, use them as often as you can.
Right? Yeah.
Do them at your daily Scrum. It doesn't matter. And now that we're working from home, inevitably what happens is somebody's kid comes screaming into the room. Their cat comes over, or dog, or whatever. So when we first started this working from home stuff, it was frowned upon. So it's an interruption. It's no, hey, embrace that head on. It's oh wow, you have a white dog. What kind of dog is that?
Yeah.
Just get into that, right? I mean, so that's one. But as far as team building activities, if you have the luxury of being co-located, you can still do what you were doing before the pandemic, right? Take your team out for lunch. But if you're not co-located, and I just recently found this out, there are companies that will cater food across disparate time zones to arrive at the same time wherever the people are. So you can still be on camera. It might be the only time when you say, everybody must be on camera because we're now about to have our pizzas or whatever. Anything like that is good. And then the last thing I'll say is this. That's the physical part, right? But you could always have a replacement to your water cooler conversations by having a water cooler chat room where people talk about stuff, not to do with work. Anything. Yeah. Today, I had one of my team members talk about how it's Friday the 13th and how Mercury is, in some planetary position. Somebody else piped in with the fact that we just discovered a black hole that's the biggest ever and all this kind of stuff. It's cool. It's cool that people get to know one another that way. So, yeah,
I discovered a black hole. It's in my backlog.
Event horizon.
It's in my backlog. Event horizon in my backlog. The closer you get to it, the slower it moves. Things that are right next to it are suspended forever. Yeah, I guess I could contribute something positive to this conversation if I have to. Team building. No, there is the influence book, Robert Cialdini, Dr. Cialdini. He says something in that book about when you do a team building exercise, you get a certain amount of goodwill from the team for a certain amount of time. That's like it wears off very quickly. It wears off too. So that's why when they have like these executive summits where they meet off site and they do a team building exercise and everyone eats a sausage or whatever they do with team building exercises, like you got to go straight into your bonding activities and activities to talk about problems and to freely discuss painful issues and stuff. You go right into that because it only lasts so long. Now, obviously, the longer the team's been together and the more the team knows each other, the longer it lasts.
Sure.
But that's the idea is you do some kind of icebreaker, you do some kind of exercise, and then you get into your retro, your deep discussion, and it will wear off. But like not doing any of that, obviously.
Again, you don't do any of that at your peril because it's essential. It's an essential ingredient, right?
Yeah.
And to that point about it wearing off, if you have churn on your team, God help you, right? I mean, you're trying to avoid that as much as possible because you always go right back to forming again when you have any change in your team consistent, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree.
I think I've had enough of team building.
No more team building. We're done.
Doing celebrations with your team, I mean, having one-on-ones with team members, all that stuff leads to extending your influence as a leader. Like if I think of like a Scrum Master or something like that, you know what I mean? We're talking about leadership capability.
Right.
Within your organization. And if you're not doing that, you're not growing your leadership capabilities. And if you're not growing your leadership capabilities as a servant leader,
right,
I mean, you're really limiting yourself. To go back to what we hammer on over and over and over again on the podcast, if you're a Scrum Master, Agile coach, whatever, in an organization, and I mean, even if you're a product manager in a large organization, like you need to be doing this with your other product managers across different groups or other managers across different groups, or again, if you're a Scrum Master or servant leader, whatever, Agile coach, across the leadership team that you interface with or your teams interface with, so that you can build those relationships. Because at some point you're going to want to go to the other team and be like, hey, we're doing this and it's going to block you, or hey, you're doing this and it's going to block us. Can you hold off?
Right.
And now you're asking for a favor, basically. And it's much better to ask for a favor when somebody knows you and you have a good working relationship and you can explain why, and they can talk about what they're doing, and maybe you can approach somebody together if it's something important. I don't know. But all that stuff starts with this.
It absolutely does. I'm going to do something I don't often do. Yes, and. Right? So the thing about this is none of this stuff is taught. You know, you don't learn about this stuff at your CSM class or CSPO class. Yeah. These are traits that you develop either deliberately or they just happen. And very few people are out there that just basically just go by and say, look, it just happens. Right? You have to work at it. Yeah. You have to work at this stuff. So if you're an Agile coach, Scrum Master, etc., pay attention to these things, right? And don't just focus on the mechanistic aspects.
Let's continue with our more valuable Scrum. Here's what I would be scared of as a product person. More valuable Scrum. I would be scared that my team is not directly connected to the product vision, working with everything that connects to the product vision, but also working with everything connects to, because you have the company vision and the product vision is directly related to that, right? And then your goals to move forward the product vision probably come out in some sort of like epic or feature or something, probably come out in some sort of backlog somewhere, right? Maybe. But that stuff, the way it comes down to a team, it comes down to a team in a sprint goal. I mean, it also comes down to a team in the product vision, like evaluating everything that they're working on, and does it go back to the product vision? And there's a back and forth with the product person, right? That's the reason you do that in your sprint planning. You talk about the goal. You agree on the sprint goal. So focusing on the goal, like if I were to talk about value and talk about something the product person can bring to the value of the Scrum team, I would start with this. I would say, you as a product person, your job is to connect their goal and to help them set a goal that contributes to all of the visions, all divisions.
All the visions. Yeah, good, bad, and ugly. No, I absolutely agree. So I'm on the side now where I wasn't a while ago, where I was preaching, you have to have a sprint goal. You must have one.
Yeah.
I've changed that a little bit lately because sometimes it's not clear what you don't have a singular sprint goal. It should always be clear what your goals are, but you have multiple goals and they don't often lend themselves to creating a singular statement, right? What ends up happening is teams go, well, we have these 4 things that we're going to do. And then it's 5, 6 things that we're going to do in this next sprint. And they're all part of the goal, but we're going to list them all out. And it ends up looking like a listing of your user stories or PBIs. So is it really serving a purpose at that point? Because you already have a sprint backlog.
Right.
So to that end, I'm kind of now aligning myself with the thinking that as long as all of those things are furthering the team and the product towards that vision, we're fine. As long as they're doing that. But if something's going astray a little bit, then it's up to the product owner and the product manager to say, why are we doing this?
Right,
Right?
We talked about this on the 1-2 podcasts ago, whatever. I don't remember what it was. Well, like I haven't posted
3,
it yet.
maybe. Yeah.
We talked about sprint goals, stuff like that. My current thinking is to pick one thing that is the goal. That is the goal. Meaning, if we abandon all the rest of the work that's in the sprint and we get this thing done, it will still be a successful sprint. I have yet to see if that's a good tactic or a not so good tactic. I don't know yet, but it's something I'm trying because you have to be like for the business. You have to be telling them with clear direction what the highest priority thing is.
Sure.
Now, certainly, every sprint that I work on, absolutely, I will tell you, we're working on more than one thing. Like we certainly are. Like some sprints, and because it's me, I'm also capturing in the sprint what percentage of the sprint, basically the team's time in the sprint, is dedicated to enhancing our technical capability and our architectural runway, technical debt, bug fixes, whatever, that kind of stuff. I do have a percentage that I aim for. Some sprints were more, some sprints were less, but extending our technical capability may not have to do with the sprint goal, which may be like develop this feature or resolve this thing for this customer or get this thing out, whatever. But my goal will be whatever is the top priority for the business. And then I'll have other stuff. Like some sprints, I've only had like one work item, which is in pursuit of the sprint goal. But then the rest of the stuff is added to the sprint. I'm fine doing that. The sprint goal for me ends up being more of a focus for the business.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. So I've had teams that are building a solution that also exists already. Like it's live, right? It's live in production and they're building out more features or capabilities to it. So the sprint goal is defined. Everybody agrees, they negotiate, all of that stuff. And they start sprinting. And then boom, suddenly something happens out of the ordinary. Yeah. Like a security vulnerability. Got to jump on it right now.
Right, yeah.
And well, there goes your sprint goal. But this is still a value. So the product owner, I would say, yeah, we didn't meet the sprint goal. No, we did because we had a pivot. And now this became the sprint goal.
Yeah.
Therefore, my messaging to the organization would be, we met our sprint goal of making the product more robust against vulnerabilities. That was not the original intent, but we met that. Now we're going to go back to that in the next sprint. You have to be open to that, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's not what I intended to talk about when we originally wrote this item up. No, because I wrote it up as, well, the nice thing is it sort of is though, because I wrote it up as goals, but I put a /focus. So it's sprint goal because that's the terminology out of the Scrum guide, but I don't think of it as sprint goal. I think of it as this is the team's main focus for the next 2 weeks, whatever the iteration is, for the next 2 weeks. And if we decide we want to throw that out and get a new focus in the middle of the sprint, first of all, I don't know if I would change the sprint goal or if I would just consider the sprint failed for the original goal and refocus and knock out the new goal and just call it a failed sprint goal. Because now it's up, now like I as a product person, well, I guess the team's kind of all accountable. But I as a product person am accountable to the business to explaining why we failed the sprint goal. And if my explanation is like, you all know, I briefed you, this security vulnerability came up, we had to stop what we were doing and resolve it. There probably will be some discussion of why we didn't predict this and solve it before that. But I am the proper person to jump in front of that. And if I'm just completely out of my depth and I don't understand it, then I'll ask whatever dev lead, tech lead, whatever to help me explain it, whatever. But I kind of am okay marking a failure if I get, this is the yes and part of this, the longest yes and ever. I'm okay marking the failure if the culture of the organization is one that says, okay, you failed. Why? Let's make sure you understand why you failed, and let's figure out how to avoid this in the future and talk about our learnings from, and then move forward with those learnings. If the organization is one that is just looking to blame somebody for it, then I might go down the road of saying I changed the sprint goal and now it's a success. Like I might change the way I operate depending on the culture of the organization. I
get exactly where you come from. From the team's perspective, though, the minute you say the sprint was blown or failed or whatever, they tend not to like that because they like, well, it's not our fault. We would have been successful, but you changed the goalposts on us. So for that reason alone, I wouldn't call it a failure, right? What I would call it is a pivot, right? For the right reasons. We met the immediate business priorities. So the business priority changed and we met it. Yeah. So in a way, I would be turning to my team going, you managed to do this in the sprint and still pivot, and great. Now can we get back to it next sprint?
I do have to say, if I change the sprint goal mid-sprint and they still accomplish the sprint goal, I kind of would be like, well, good job. Like
as many of you.
I threw the whole sprint goal out and changed it, and you still succeeded in
that is the goal now, right? You passed the new goal.
That kind of is more impressive, actually, than that I changed the goal. I mean, obviously, you don't want to change the goal mid-sprint like that. This kind of dovetails into our... Oh, you haven't heard that word in a while. It kind of dovetails into our next point, and I'm not even sure where this point came from, which is start finishing and stop starting, or stop starting and start finishing. I don't know what we heard.
Thing. Yeah. Start finishing. I don't know, whichever way it is. It's the same thing, right? Yeah. So I think this talks about teams that basically roll things forward from one sprint to the next. Yeah. And they do that hiding under excuses sometimes. So as a Scrum Master, a product owner, I mean, it's really up to everybody, but leadership of the team, basically. It's a Scrum Master for sure, Agile coach, product owner. Look at that and go, if that happens once, look at the root causes. What happened? Do we have, what were some of the headwinds that we came across? The dependencies on external teams, etc. But then if it happens again, there's something wrong here, right? Look at that. Are your stories too big, right? Well, what's going on? Are you slicing horizontally instead of vertically? Yeah. Why are we pushing forward every time?
Yeah, you know, the worst people for this that I've interacted with is team leads. They're the worst people for this. They have 8 dozen things in flight, and I'm like, can you get something done for us? I remember a team I was on where the only person who could deal with IDAM or IDM or whatever, like identity access management, basically. IDAM, some people call it IDAM, some people call it IDM or something like that. Anyway, the point is, like, the team lead was the only person who could deal with access and identity management and stuff like that. I don't know why. That stuff's not difficult to deal with. It's not. But and they were the only person that could deal with like the networking of, like, I give you access to operate in this environment or whatever. You know, that particular program had jump hosts to different network segments. Yeah. Sure. And I'm just some rando Scrum Master over here. Like, I know how to deal with all this. Like, networking is. But for some reason, all that stuff was gated behind a team lead, and the team lead, he always was like 60-hour a week plus kind of guy, and waiting on him to do even the most minor, like, I need access to this box, like a simple 5-minute, get him on a call, screen share, log on to the jump host, give the person access, have the person screen share back, check that they have access. Like 5 minutes if we were sitting next to each other, sit next to you, put my laptop down, you have access now. That took weeks. Put in a ticket, got to have the ticket verified, need your supervisor, Scrum Master, whatever, I don't know why, to verify that yes, you do need access, and and then up the chain, down the chain.
Oh yeah, I've lived through that nightmare.
Weeks. It took weeks just to get like somebody on an access list. I'm like,
these are the built-in inefficiencies, right? Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen where you wait for a few days and then the ticket gets closed mysteriously. It's like, okay, what happened here? I've seen that. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. So when you have gates like that, what do you do? Realistically, oftentimes it's not because of technical issues why you have these gates. It's all political.
Yeah, but the point of that program, the point of you bring up the example of that program was, at any one time he must have had like, I don't know, 50 tickets like that in flight. So like what you could have done in that environment, I don't know, maybe what you could have done in that environment is maybe you could have had a person on each team that the team lead could have delegated delegated that authority to. Maybe if you had one person on each team that you trusted. But again, going back to our retrospective thing, like you would need someone from the team to say, hey, this is a problem. What can we do? What is within our control? I had a manager one time who always used to ask, it was super annoying because I didn't really understand what he was asking at this point in my career. What can you take within your responsibility to get over the problem? Don't say that your team lead is super slow and is controlling or whatever. Have you approach your team lead to try to get somebody on your team that they trust to delegate this IDAM management to. Right. I almost don't want to say IDAM because I think that it's going to think that I'm cursing. But it was things like that. It's like, well, what can you take ownership of? Well, I as a Scrum Master, this team member who is a member of our direct leadership, basically our direct the lead of the team or whatever, who doesn't necessarily sit on our team, but they're at a program level. They are a blocker for any identity access management stuff. So maybe I can get them to delegate. And if you can't get them to delegate, then at least you tried. And then, or maybe you can escalate to their direct, supervisor or whatever. Right. Maybe there's other things you can do without, obviously there's some politics involved, right? But try the direct route first and at least have a conversation. And it's pretty minor to just have a conversation, right?
But it all stems from that solution orientation that you talked about, right? So what in your control can you do to solve the problem instead of saying, you got a problem here, right?
The other thing with this topic of start finishing and stop starting is when you're walking the board, like assuming you use the walk the board method, which you totally should do, and you should check out our podcast about daily stand-up or the daily Scrum or walking the board. I don't really know what podcast we did walking the board in.
It's one of them.
Yeah, it's one of them. Yeah, I should be able to link the video when we end this to be like, this is our walk the board. Let's be honest, I'm just going to cut this out. That's too much work. It's too much work. You can add a card that says, hey, this is the video. The thing with this topic about walking the board, it gives you a great opportunity to go down the list of things that are in progress to say, what does it take to get this finished? Mm-hmm. And then like, whoa, before we pull something in from the backlog, can we swarm on this item to get it done quickly rather than having, well, I'm waiting on this and I'm doing whatever, so I'm going to pick up another item from the backlog and then I'm going to work on that, but I'm not going to really have enough time to finish in the sprint. And then when this blocker clears, I'll be able to work on the item that really was a priority. And now I've got 2-3 items in progress while I'm waiting on different things like, instead of that, can we just go sit at someone's desk until they're there to give you the access that you needed? Go stalk the person. Go, I don't know, go do a workaround. I don't know.
I agree fully. So stop bringing work in when you have blockers. Definitely do not have a blocker column on your board. That's just wrong because things will sit there and then it'll just encourage you to bring in something else because, that's a blocker, right?
It's blocked.
So I'm just going to avoid that. No, forget that. No, fix it. To your point, like swarm on it. Don't bring in more stuff. Definitely limit WIP and all of that good stuff that everybody knows about. Yeah, definitely encourage people to say, slow down.
Oh boy.
Don't bring in stuff.
Oh, slowing down to speed up. Oh boy, we just we're burning the candle at both ends now with some people. There's some people like, what? I'm like, yeah, we are proposing like, hey, that item that's completely blocked, you can't move forward with or whatever, like kick it out of your sprint and send it back to the backlog. And then let your business people, let your product people take that and communicate it back to the business. We can't work on this.
Right.
Imagine the kickback when they hear that we started working on this and we figured out that we couldn't work on it. Things are just going to go from bad to worse when that gets communicated back to the business. Like, yeah, we can't get access to the machine that we need to get access to because the person who approves it is really, really slow and they normally turn around in 3 days, but they've been out of office or whatever. If you start climbing the ladder, like if you go high enough, it just sounds like excuses.
Of course it is. That's exactly what it is too, right?
Yeah.
It's an excuse. We can't get someone to respond to us, so we can't work on this. Like,
yeah.
But you can't do that. I'm going to get somebody else in who can.
Right, yeah.
That's the next course of action, right? So, yeah, I absolutely agree. As a Scrum Master, PO for that matter, working with your team to say, what can we do to break through this rather than push it back?
Well, not picking up something that is going to be blocked, it would be the first step. Again, this goes to our topic of slowing down to speed up is when you do your sprint planning, and you identify like, well, we got to get this other team to give us access, bring them into the sprint planning and have them give you access right there in the sprint planning, and treat them like a subject matter expert. Be like, you need to stop and give us access. Let me verify my access. Okay, cool. You spent 20 minutes in the sprint planning out of your whatever 4 hours.
Right.
Okay, time well spent. But that dependency is knocked down. But if you can't get that by the end of the sprint planning, by the time that 4-hour window closes, you can't take that item into the sprint.
That's right.
So your product
or run a spike in some cases. Not in this example.
You run a spike, but like run the spike. Don't take the story.
That's right.
Take the spike to get the work in. Like, well, that's a whole different discussion about spikes.
Sure.
I want to have that discussion in a separate podcast.
Yeah.
I feel like teams are hesitant to mobilize their product people to deal with blockers. I feel, especially in larger programs I've been part of, they're real quick to say, well, your Scrum Master deal with the blocker or whatever. But like the first person I would go to deal with the blocker would be the developer that's working on the item, because most likely if you're like this IDAM thing, it's been a big problem in other programs. That's why I keep harping on it. Mm-hmm. But other problems have been like standing up environments or syncing environments, production and test environments, stuff like that.
Right.
Those people that you need to do those kind of activities, if they don't sit on the team, bring them into your planning, and the people who can bring people into planning easily are the product people. Absolutely. We need your time or I can't work on this. And if you can't get that time as a product person, cool, super easy. Like escalate, bring your Scrum Master along to help you, escalate it to other people in the organization. And when the business and the Scrum Master, even if that Scrum Master is a part-time developer, when the business and the Scrum Master are together going to different people in the organization, I think that raises more eyebrows than just a random Scrum Master being like, hey, can I get some one-on-one time?
Absolutely.
Talk about whatever.
Well, you're right. Absolutely, I agree. The other thing that happens if you don't do it that way is a Scrum Master, so the developer is going to say, hey, we have a blocker. And the Scrum Master is going to go, okay, let me go see what I can do about that. And then they'll get to the product owner, right, and say, well, we have a blocker here. What I'm saying is it serializes this, as opposed to that. This is why I'm a fan of having product owners in the Scrum, right? In the daily Scrum, we have a blocker. Who can help with this? Mm-hmm. Mr. Product, let's get together. Let's get this through, right? Yeah. So I agree. I think we need to encourage this mentality that product owners aren't them and the team isn't us. It's all of us together. Yeah.
Well, again, the product owner is part of the team. So if the product owner is part of the team, then when you go to have that retro, kind of what we were talking about before about a team holding itself accountable, when you go to have that retro, the product owner is part of the taking responsibility is to say, well, we started the sprint. We didn't really realize that this was going to be a blocker. We missed a sprint goal. We missed whatever. Product owner is part of that. They can't. The product owner can't just say like, "Oh, these developers are so slow, and I didn't know why they didn't know that they had dependencies." Right? Whatever. Yeah. Like, you can't be doing that. Actually, I would say the Scrum Master is the perfect person to be the leader on the team to help them understand they should be accepting responsibility, stuff like that.
Yep.
Except some organizations are like, we don't need a Scrum Master. We can just here's $5 on my pocket. We don't need a Scrum Master. Like, you really need one. There's a lot of reasons why. But if you're not going to have one, if you're going to commit to not having one, I mean, that a lot of that leadership now falls back on the product person to punch through in your organization. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would hope that your developers can mobilize throughout the organization to do that, but in my experience,
I was going to say I haven't seen a lot of that.
Yeah,
I agree.
The last topic here is agree on what done means and then get to it. I guess this manifests in the definition of done. To have a more valuable Scrum, you have to agree what done means, right? I see that. I got to think about this for a second, because I've been on teams that move the goalposts with regard to starting on a work item, and then the product owner is like, oh, I like this, but I want this or whatever, and then they kind of change and add acceptance criteria as the sprint goes on. And as the team discovers things. But I feel like this one is kind of knocked down by proper planning. And I feel this one's also knocked down by the more presence that the product person has on the team, and the more refinements they have, the more input that the more time the product person spends, the less that this is a problem. I have been on teams that mid-sprint they add more acceptance criteria and stuff like that. But
I think there's a delicate balance that we need to kind of highlight here, right? So that is, you don't need to know everything about a story when you bring it into a sprint. You can learn more and inspect as you go forward. But with coming back to this definition of done thing, the done here really needs to think about business orientation rather than technical done. Like, all my tests pass, so I'm done. Yeah. You're really not, because your definition of done might say this is not only tested, it's also deployed somewhere. right? So where business people can actually touch it and feel it. So what about that?
Yeah.
So consider this holistically. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, and the other things that I expect teams will struggle is when they start integrating with other teams. And when they're part of a program, like you really need to get together with the other teams and talk about the definition of done, especially if you're doing continuous deployment or honestly, continuous integration is what it is. If you're doing trunk-based development where everything just goes out of production all the time, you really need to standardize your definition of done across all your teams.
That's true. You also need an integrated test environment where you can test all of this with other teams, because otherwise the tendency is to say, hey, it ain't my problem.
Yeah.
You know, and I see that all the time in larger programs.
Yeah. This one's a tough one. Like this one could be an entire episode, I think. I kind of think we stumbled onto one of those topics that we can't really, I don't think we're going to do it justice at the final 5 minutes or whatever of this podcast, because the concerning part of this one is just what you talked about, the different environments, like merge policies and code reviews and check-ins and stuff like that, and familiarizing your other teams with the code that's being checked in and deployed. I think of like a program level sprint review. Like when I was running a program with like 7 teams, at the sprint review, all the teams, we would do the business facing release stories with the business people on the call, and then we'd cut the business people in the 45 minutes or whatever, show them some UIs and some stuff, or maybe it was a data program, so we'd show them the back end of some data, and then we cut them, and then it'd be the rest of the engineers from the rest of the teams looking through the integrations, because they needed to know what was happening in very far apart, different parts of the platform. But I mean, there was, in the next sprint, some other team might work on something that we did this sprint because it was all one product.
Right. So you're right. I think this is a deeper subject.
It's a very deep subject.
We could dig into this in the next podcast.
But I mean, we hit a lot of different categories that were about making your Scrum more valuable. Rather than just like laying down Scrum because the organization is like, we're Scrum now. You project managers, you're all Scrum masters. Yay! That's not really. You're not getting value out of that.
Right.
But if you're looking for things to increase your value, kind of step through in the order that we kind of step through these. Think about your organization, step through them, and maybe improve.
Let us know what you think.
That's true.
Subscribe and like.
And like and subscribe.
And that too.